Madam Chair, Ranking Member Deutsch, distinguished members, it's an honor and a pleasure to appear before you again today, this time to talk about U.S. policy towards Syria. It's hard for anyone to look at Syria and be satisfied, least of all U.S. government officials. There's an important difference, though, between being dissatisfied with conditions in Syria and terming U.S. policy a failure. There's an even bigger difference between being dissatisfied with policy and implementing one that will actually work better. As we discovered all too well in Iraq, not all alternatives to a troubled policy are an improvement. Indeed, from George H.W. Bush's policy of engagement with Iraq in the late 1980s to a policy of coercive diplomacy in the 1990s to a policy of invasion and reconstruction in the 2000s, we've seen several decades of U.S. policies that have failed to meet even modest expectations set for them. Iraq is a reminder of our limited ability to shape outcomes in complex and polarized situations, and a reminder that the quality of outcomes sometimes has only a distant relationship to the level of effort and resources that we put into them. 6 years ago, the full Foreign Affairs Committee held a hearing with a somewhat more sober title than the present hearing, entitled "Iraq, Is the Escalation Working?" And Madam Chair, at that hearing, you quite correctly said, before writing off Iraq as lost, we must ask ourselves what alternative policy there is, and what are the consequences for the safety of our troops and for the United States' strategic interests in predetermining defeat. I totally agree. And it's that constructive spirit that you brought to the task then that I'd like to bring to the table today. As you suggested at the time, the proper measure of a policy is the prospect of its alternatives. In order to judge that, one must first decide one's interests that the policy is seeking to preserve and the tools at hand to protect those interests. To me, the starting point is that Syria is strategically important because of its effects on its neighbors and its neighborhood. By both geography and design, Syria is a hub state. All five of Syria's neighbors are important to the United States. The second aspect that needs attention is the rise of jihadi groups in Syria who feed on the conflict to recruit worldwide. The third aspect is the malign efforts of Iran, Russia, and others to shape a status quo in the Middle East that's deeply unfavorable to American interests. The written testimony goes into considerably more detail than I can do so here, but I have 5 basic recommendations for U.S. policy going forward, which represent modifications of our current policy rather than its abandonment. The first is safe havens. I share the American public's caution about committing troops to Syria, and I fear that we could be drawn into actions that we neither intend nor desire. But the first point I made about the fragility of neighboring states straining under the flow of refugees needs attention. It seems to me we should be actively considering the creation of safe havens. The key is to have limited objectives in doing so and not to provide a base for people in those areas to try to overthrow the regime, because ultimately that just puts us into the fight. Second is weapons. I see wisdom in providing limited weapons for self-defense with the desire of helping civilians protect their homes, rather than with the hope that weapons can tip the balance in the war. On diplomacy, as many of you said, we have been pursuing diplomacy with friends and foes alike, but from the outside it looks to me like there's too much agreeing to disagree. We can't care about everything, but we should care deeply about the diplomacy surrounding Syria and make clear that it affects the core of our relationships. This is true for our allies. This is true for our relations with Russia. And I think that we have to be more creative as we deal with Russia, finding potential future courses of policy that are more agreeable to us than they are to the Russians. On intelligence, jihadi networks are notoriously hard to penetrate, but given the fact that they have to recruit so much, this should be a bonanza for friendly services to infiltrate Al-Qaeda and its affiliated networks and try to understand them. We should also look for ways to share intelligence with carefully vetted fighting groups in order to help compensate for the superior aerial coverage of the Assad regime. In terms of a settlement, I agree with you, Madam Chair, that as odious as the Assad regime is, there's little question that even more odious characters lurk in Syria. A settlement that arises from a negotiated transfer of power stands a far greater chance of improving Syrians' lives than building from the ashes of even deeper sectarian killings and ethnic cleansing. I don't suggest this path because it's the perfect one, but because it seems to me to be the best out of a series of really bad choices. We could clearly dislodge Bashar al-Assad with enough time, money, and lives, but it's unclear we want to pay that price or how we might shape the aftermath. There isn't a simple solution to the problem of Syria, and even with the commitment of much greater funds, the battle is likely to last for many more years. When I worked on the Hill myself with Congressman Connolly, The U.S. government supported decades-long insurgencies in Afghanistan and Nicaragua and helped defend the government of El Salvador in its own decade of war. Regardless of what happens to Bashar tomorrow, the problems of Syria will be with us for years to come. We all have hopes for Syria, and I'd argue that sentiment in the United States is relatively unified as to what a positive outcome in Syria would look like. Yet rather than focus on our hopes, we have to focus on our needs. We must pursue a policy that meets those needs for Syria while being attendant to the other demands placed on our military and our government. Our interests call for focus and not for hopes. Thank you.
Thank you very much.